This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 329 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into this week's trends, I wanted to send another reminder about OddsFire. You guys need to check it out. You can easily watch line movement, you can shop for the best lines in each market, and you can even see which side is getting the most bets and money. It's the premier odds comparison experience across major bookmakers in the regulated U.S. market. And it's all in one place at oddsfire.com. Check it out. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. So the first trend this week is one that I actually tweeted out, but it's a fun one, so I wanted to mention it. Over the last 5 weeks, here are the leaders in fantasy points per game at quarterback. Lamar Jackson, no surprise there. Ryan Tannehill is second. Jameis Winston is third. Josh Allen is fourth. And Mitch Trubisky is fifth. I've gotten a lot of questions on Twitter over the last couple of weeks about players like Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers and what to do with them. And my advice is this. There are very few studs at the quarterback position in fantasy football. Very few. Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson are not must-start players. Rodgers has been totally boom or bust, and Wilson's been mediocre over the second half of the season. And the list of top 5 players over the last 5 weeks shows this. It shows us how replaceable the quarterback position really is. Over the last 2 weeks, Odell Beckham has averaged a 19% target share per game. During his first 11 games this season, that number was 27%. Maybe this has to do with the sports hernia injury that was reported last week, but regardless, it's not a good trend for one of the biggest busts of the fantasy football season. And speaking of OBJ, he's only scored 2 touchdowns this year. He's scoring on every 54 targets. Over his career before becoming a Cleveland Brown, he scored on every 14 targets. Everyone pokes fun at the Cardinals for being awful at covering the tight end, and it's true. They suck at defending tight ends. But when adjusted for strength of opponent this season, Seattle really isn't that far behind. Arizona's allowed 6.5 points above expectation to team tight ends this year, when Arizona's at 5.6. Then the third worst team, Oakland, is at 2.6. So a good way off from the other two teams. That's good news for Ian Thomas this week. For trend 4, let's talk about the Rams wide receivers. Cooper Kupp played just 28.6% of the Rams snaps this past week. He's now had about a 13.5% target share over his last 2 games. When asked about this, Sean McVay said, quote, "I think a lot of it is, what do we think is the best way to have a little bit of balance on some of the early downs? What do we think is the best way in some instances to run the football?" And then he added, "It is also predicated on, all right, what does this defense do, and what does that mean in terms of some of the matchups that you want to create?" This isn't very good news for Cooper Kupp, because it means that he's much more volatile than we originally thought. I don't mind him this week, but it's still a downgrade on his overall outlook. And then there's Robert Woods. While Kupp's been struggling to see volume, Bobby Woods has averaged a 37% target share over his last 2 games. And he finally found the end zone last week too. All of this means is that the team is going to be less predictable moving forward. Now, I talk about touchdown rates a lot on this show and how they tend to regress. How Patrick Mahomes' huge touchdown rate last year wasn't going to be repeated, or it likely wasn't going to be repeated. And even though I'm the biggest Lamar Jackson fan out there, and even though I touted Lamar Jackson like crazy this offseason, I think it's important to point out that he's someone who's also due for some regression in the passing game. So far this season, based on his yardage total, he's thrown 11.4 more touchdowns than a quarterback typically would have over the last 5 years. That's based on passing yards. Just a passing yards to touchdown conversion. Even if we cut that number in half because the Ravens' offense is so dynamic and Jackson's dual threat ability helps him be more efficient and see softer coverage, even if we cut it in half, then he's still outperforming in the passing touchdown column by quite a bit. And his touchdown rate shows this too. It's 8.1%. It may not regress this season, but we shouldn't expect an 8% rate year over year. It's just something to think about. Trend 6 is that Devin Singletary has now ranked as the RB 16, 9, and 13 over the last 3 weeks. And in week 14, he saw an 81% running back rush share and a 22% target share. Those are elite numbers at the running back position. He's now played at least 71% of Buffalo's snaps in each of his last 4 games, and his usage continues to climb. Even though he's got a really, really tough matchup against Pittsburgh this week, I think most teams should still play him because we know that running back alternatives in fantasy football right now suck. His usage is what's most important, and it's been there. Over the last 5 weeks, the Carolina Panthers have allowed running backs to rush for 727 rushing yards. That's by far the most in the league, even more than Jacksonville. I'll talk about this probably more in my matchup show, but this scares the hell out of me for Russell Wilson this week in the passing offense. We know Seattle loves to run, so they could really limit his volume against the worst rush defense in football. On the season, Jameis Winston has thrown it 15 or more air yards 117 times. That's 14 more times than the quarterback ranked second on the list, which is Phillip Rivers. And at his current pace, Winston could come close to hitting the high and deep ball attempts since 2011. That's 151 from Andrew Luck and Matthew Stafford back in 2012. This is why I think that you should take shots on the waiver wire with guys like Brashad Perriman and maybe even Justin Watson, especially given the Buccaneers' final 2 matchups of the fantasy football season. Because as we know, Jameis Winston just doesn't give up. It wouldn't be a 10 Trends episode without a little Green Bay backfield talk. Aaron Jones had a big day on Sunday, and that came with strong peripheral numbers. He ended the game with a 26% target share, which is nuts, and then a 70% running back rush share. His target share was a season high in a single game, and the running back rush share was the highest mark that he'd seen since week 9. So things are trending in the right direction, but as we've seen in the past with his backfield, it can swing in Jamal Williams' favor very quickly and easily. The last trend today is about quarterbacks. More quarterback trends. But we've seen some really interesting first half versus second half of the season splits this season at the quarterback position, especially with Tom Brady, Matt Ryan, and Russell Wilson. For Brady, if you look at his first 6 games, which were largely against easy opponents, he was averaging over 20 points per game. And that includes one performance where he only scored 3.7 points. Brady had 5 top 12 performances over his first 6 games this year. Since then, he's been in the top 12 in weekly scoring just once. Since week 6, Brady's averaged 14 fantasy points. I get that this is an arbitrary split, but of the quarterbacks since week 6 with at least 5 games played, there have been 29 of them. Of those 29 quarterbacks, Tom Brady is 26th in fantasy points per game. Matt Ryan ranks 27th. He's been awful after averaging 23 points per game across his first 6 games. And then there's Russell Wilson. Through week 6, he was averaging almost 26 points per game. Since then, it's down to 17.5, and that includes a huge 39-point performance. I don't know what happened after week 6 for these guys, except for the fact that Ryan Tannehill became starter for the Titans in week 7, and then everything just got weird. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. And as always, guys, if you listen to the show on Apple Podcasts, do me a huge favor and leave a rating and review. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly Matchup Show.